Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Understanding the Elements of Your Vendor's Cybersecurity Program webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Questions, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Lisa Mayhill, VinMinder's Director of Information Security Operations. She will discuss which vendors require cybersecurity reviews and when and how to do them. Lisa will also cover what to do in the event of a data breach or other cyber incident. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our What Vendor Documents Are Needed to Assess Cybersecurity infographic, 7 Layers of Protection Against Third-Party Cybersecurity Risk infographic, Vendor Cybersecurity Checklist, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Lisa. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jessie. So I'm just going to take a second to go over our agenda. Today we're going to talk about why vendor cybersecurity preparedness is important, what vendors should be tested, reviewed, and when. We're going to talk about some important questions that you need to ask and some details surrounding those. And then what to review, as well as some common security testing to perform, what to look at when you're doing these cybersecurity reviews. We're also going to touch on, the privacy laws that are currently in place today and take a look at some recent breaches just as examples of, why we do this work. And then we're going to wrap up with some red flags to look out for as well as some key takeaways. So let's get started and jump right in. Okay, so jumping right in, what is your vendor's cybersecurity posture? What are we talking about? What we're really saying is determining whether your vendor is prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to a cybersecurity issue or an event. What is their posture? So a lot of times we invest in our own company's cybersecurity preparedness, but we don't put that same effort into investing into ensuring our vendors are doing the same. And really the best way to do that is through our third-party risk management programs. So the first thing you're going to want to do is identify the cyber threats that your vendor could present to you, and then take proactive steps to mitigate potential areas of weakness. You want to ensure that you're determining if your vendor's data is going to be secure, as well as your organizations and your customers. And then you want to review if your vendor is prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to a cybersecurity issue. So what are they doing to prevent issues, detect them if they do happen, and respond to them if the ultimate worst case scenario occurs? So I think we all understand at a high level why cybersecurity is important. When we're talking about our vendors, though, really it's kind of two-pronged, right? When we're talking about why it's important, enabling your risk mitigation allows you to influence your vendors to strengthen their controls, right? So if you're coming to the table with the knowledge of what's going on, you're able to kind of bring to them what you need them to do to secure your environment as well as theirs. This also allows you to proactively supplement their controls with controls of your own. If you're evaluating what they're doing, then you can add or delete on your side as necessary. And then, of course, understanding where they are at from a cybersecurity perspective lets you make a decision up front whether you want to stay with them or work with a particular vendor. And then, of course, on the flip side, cybersecurity is just a huge hot-button issue with regulators, clients. In a lot of cases, in a lot of industries, it's required that you demonstrate that you're taking proactive steps to identify and mitigate potential areas of weakness with your vendors. And really, you're expected, as best practice, to cover that CIA information security triad, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And you know, there's also reputational risk to consider. You want to make sure that you're always doing the best of your ability so that if something does happen, you know, your reputation isn't impacted. You know, 2023 is not even over yet, and we've seen some of the biggest data breaches to date. I would be surprised if nobody on this call was impacted by the MoveIt ransomware breach. You know, it had a major trickle-down effect because obviously MoveIt is a huge company. It's a file transfer application, and there was just a very large trickle-down for a lot of different vendors using that. So that was just a very big deal this year. I'm sure most of you are aware of it. Darkbeam, September saw the biggest data breach of the year at Darkbeam. They're a digital risk protection company, and they confirmed that 3.8 billion records were compromised, which is just insane. And then the University of Minnesota is another one. You know, they confirmed recently an attack that compromised personal data, which included reported 7 million unique Social Security numbers. And this is just three. These are just three of many. But, you know, we bring them up because I think it's important to understand, you know, that the impact really is real. And I think in 2023 we saw that probably more so than in the past. So here's a listing of privacy laws according to IAPP. You know, to date, there are 12 states that have passed comprehensive privacy laws. This doesn't mean that there are not other laws in place that touch on privacy or data protections. New York State has a data protection law, but these are very specific to privacy and the release and use of personal information, not just data overall. So, you know, we've touched on these in previous webinars. This is a reference slide for you all, and I highly recommend checking out the IAPP.org site. They have a real-time updated privacy law map, and they also cover a lot of data protection information, but it's a great organization to familiarize yourself with because they really put out some great information about privacy laws as they come forward. And it's all real-time information, which is awesome. So I think the big thing as we get, you know, deeper into this throughout this webinar, the thing to remember about cybersecurity is that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. The domino effect is real. Like, these are all kind of cliche phrases, but they really apply here because ultimately all it takes is one weak link to have a really bad situation arise. So making sure that you're not that weakest link and your vendors aren't that weakest link is really what cybersecurity preparedness is about. Industry best practice and regulatory guidance wants you to consider all potential ramifications posed by a third party, right? So whether this is in the form of a data breach or a business disruption, they want you to understand what could happen, how it could happen, and then proactively prevent it from happening. So from a planning standpoint, you need to consider all the possible problems that can occur. And that means, you know, what steps you need to be prepared to take and how long until normal operations can resume. And that's just to minimize the impact to your organization and your customers. So it's really about evaluating that risk and then proactively preventing it as much as you can, or at least softening the blow if it does happen.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, does your organization focus on cybersecurity of your third parties as part of their due diligence? Yes, no, depends on the vendor, or you're not sure. Lisa, we have some time here to answer one of the questions from the audience. And this question is, Should every vendor have a cybersecurity posture or just critical and high-risk vendors?
Thanks, Jessie. That's a good question. All organizations should have some level of cybersecurity preparedness. Depending on what type of services they offer and what type of data they store or process, how important their products are to their clients, all those things should really weigh into how deep and robust their cybersecurity program should be. That being said, there are very few examples that I can even think of that don't need, some level of cybersecurity protections in place. Especially now, everything is digital, right? And so for most organizations, at least some part of their operation uses some type of digital processing. Whether it's a tiny food truck that's processing small amounts on credit cards or large international banks, it's really likely that you cannot build in, or it's unlikely that you cannot build in some level of cybersecurity protection. Now, when it comes to assessing your vendors, I think the level of review is certainly impacted by their level of risk and criticality. You should evaluate your vendors for impacts like risk and criticality and then focus your resources if you have to choose. Start with those high and critical vendors and work your way down.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, I'd like to remind you that in the Related Content widget, you'll find helpful resources. One of those is our 7 layers of protection against third-party cybersecurity risk infographic. With that, Lisa, back to you.
That's some great feedback, guys. Thank you. So we mentioned earlier the CIA Information Security Triad. What is that? I talk about this in a lot of my cybersecurity webinars because it really is the foundation of cybersecurity in its most simplistic form. And really what it includes is confidentiality, which is preventing the unauthorized disclosure of information. And in order to guarantee confidentiality in the CIA triad, vendor communication channels and media have to be properly monitored and controlled to prevent unauthorized access. There are some key concepts here like the principle of least privilege or the separation of duties, and those simple things can start you down that right path towards confidentiality. The I stands for integrity, and what this means is you have to ensure that data is not modified by unauthorized means. To guarantee integrity under the CIA triad, vendors should be able to demonstrate to you that they have controls in place to protect information from unauthorized modification. One way to do this is by ensuring proper input processing and output controls are in place. And the A stands for availability. This is ensuring that information is available when it's needed and only to those authorized to have it. Vendors should be able to validate how they prevent and handle downtime and interruptions. And, these 3 things together create the triad, but they obviously have their own implications and pieces throughout this cybersecurity preparedness process. So we'll talk a little bit more about them as we go. So when we're talking about cybersecurity risk and cybersecurity preparedness for our vendors, we need to understand what type of vendors should be reviewed. At a minimum, you want to focus on your high and critical risk vendors. And, but how do we determine which vendors are high or critical risk? The simplest way is to ask yourself 2 questions. Does the vendor process, store, or transmit non-public customer data, such as PII or personally identifiable information? And does the vendor provide a part of your service that would degrade your service's value if it were unavailable? If the answer is yes to those questions, then you want to start with those vendors. And once you determine which vendors you're going to review, who does those reviews? On the cybersecurity side of due diligence, you want someone with demonstrable knowledge across information security to perform those reviews. You want someone with experience because you don't want them to just turn into checkbox activities. realistically, that person probably isn't going to be your third-party risk manager directly, but rather a supporting resource from your internal information security team, or at least a relationship between them. If those resources aren't available within your organization, you may want to consider outsourcing to a third-party management service provider for assistance, or somebody who has that information security knowledge. You want to ensure that the process continues with the manager in charge of the relationship with the vendor, so that when additional action has to be taken, it is, and that the vendor review isn't just performed as that checkbook activity to the organization itself. People often ask what type of qualifications should a person have, and really a broad background in information security and risk management, or an experienced information security professional is what we always recommend. When we're talking about the when of assessing, when we talk about the life cycle, we really focus on two primary areas when we're talking about cybersecurity, and that's onboarding and ongoing. You don't want to just do your cybersecurity due diligence during onboarding and then have it be one and done and move on. You need to be doing it in an ongoing way. You need to continue to review them on that ongoing basis, because things can always change, especially in information security and cybersecurity. So you really need to stay on top of that. And we see that overlooked a lot. Organizations fail to monitor on an ongoing basis, and that's a lot of times where issues are caused down the road. Ongoing monitoring is equally as important as that initial onboarding or vetting phase. Okay, so let's just take a little time here to talk about important questions that you need to ask of your vendor. This is a little bit different than the testing you should do and the review you should do. This is really just like when you're approaching a vendor, here are just some questions to either say out loud or have in your head as you're kind of going through their documentation and that process. So the first thing is there a formal information security program in place? A formal program should be the framework for keeping the vendor at a desired security level. The program should outline specific details like, how do they assess risk? How do they mitigate risk? How do they plan to keep security practices current? How often is it reviewed? Is there leadership buy-in? Those are all things that are just really important about that program, just from that high level. And then what type of regular testing is being performed? We're going to talk about that in detail a little bit later on, but the vendor really should have evidence of regular testing, penetration testing, vulnerability scanning and testing, application testing, social engineering, and they should be done by a qualified third-party vendor, ideally. A lot of companies do it internally. Some of those are okay, and sometimes you really want that impartial third party. You might also need to evaluate, what is their social engineering testing process? Does it include simulating phishing emails? What about employee awareness? You want to verify the details about how often testing is performed. Are they tested annually, or is it one and done when employees are hired? A lot of times this kind of questioning can reveal whether the vendor is prepared to identify weakness, and are their employees prepared? So it really is a critical part. So asking that information up front is important. And then, is there a formal user access process? Does it include the principle of least privilege and the separation of duties? One of the top reasons for exceptions that we see in SOC reports is a failure in logical access. And this is like at the termination stage, as well as the extension of privileges stage. So, do they have a written process? Is it documented? Is it signed off? Is it reviewed? What is that process? What do they do to ensure that user access is reviewed regularly? And then, is the principle of least privilege and multi-factor authentication implemented for remote access, right? We have a huge transition these last few years into remote work being incredibly common. Have they updated their policies and procedures for that? Is multi-factor or MFA, implemented for remote access? So these are all just kind of things that kind of circle around that logical access that you really want to understand. And then, of course, how is data protected, especially in transit and at rest, when it's expired, end of life? Those should all be policies that you should be able to validate, and they should be able to verify that they're always protecting your organization's data and your customers' data. So things like encryption are important to understand. Are they using the most current standards? Is it something that aligns with your expectations? And then on the flip side of that, when media or data is expired or it's at its end of life, what's their disposal process? Is that something that you can have a say in when it's your data? And then, how are users trained and educated? This goes back to security awareness training. It's important that vendors can demonstrate that every agent of theirs that has access to your data has the level of training that meets your expectations. So you want to make sure that you understand what their education policy as far as, is it annual, is it one and done? So that's important to understand as well. And then incident management and response procedures, are they comprehensive? So, I think it's important that proper incident management and response procedures include details on analyzing, prioritizing, and responding to cyber incidents and other events, but also identification. So you want to understand, how do they identify? What's the threshold? Breach notifications are a part of this, but incident management should also be tested regularly. They have to be able to verify that their process is effective. And you may want to consider whether that vendor has cybersecurity insurance coverage. And we'll talk about this all more, down in a little bit. And then understanding, what types of technical prevention methods are in place. It seems like a lot. We're going to break it down a little, but these are just important questions to have in your head, as we go through the rest of this webinar.
Our second poll question of the day is, do you discuss breach and incident notification expectations with your vendors? Yes, no, with some, or you're not sure. Lisa, I have another question here that we could go ahead and answer. And this question is, am I responsible for things like providing credit monitoring to customers if my vendor was the one with the breach?
That's a great question, and there are certainly some requirements of things that you have to do, but I don't think that something as specific as credit monitoring is one of them. But I do think it's a solid show of good faith, and it allows you to demonstrate that you're taking the impact to your customers seriously, not just the impact to you. And ultimately, you need your customers in order to operate in most cases. So ensuring that they're protected and that you are there to support them through a breach caused by one of your vendors is really a great first step. No one wants to tell their customers that a third party you chose to work with compromised their data. But if you can at least come to the table with solutions and evidence that you have planned for worst case scenarios and what you're doing demonstrates that you're taking care of them, that you were prepared, that can really go a long way with helping ensure that you retain that customer support and trust, which, as everything has impact to your reputation. So maybe it's not required, but it's certainly a good idea.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I would like to quickly direct your attention back to the related content widget, where you will find our What Vendor Documents Are Needed to Assess Cybersecurity infographic. This handy resource discusses some guidelines that can help you understand which documents should be collected and reviewed to assess your vendor's cybersecurity. Okay, Lisa, let's continue with the presentation.
So another great start to your cybersecurity process or evaluating your vendor's cybersecurity process is to start at that contract level. You want to consider including provisions within your contracts related to the following areas. Accessibility to the vendor's cyber policies and procedures. That's like the right to audit. You want to make sure that you and your vendor are on the same page about what you expect to be able to audit and see from them regarding their cybersecurity program. You want to make sure that you're on the same page about independent testing requirements. The testing requirements should demonstrate the ability to meet cybersecurity objectives. Your requirements might be different from theirs, so you want to make sure that you put that forward right at the beginning. You want to make sure you document the frequency and availability of test results. When considering that frequency and availability, you want to keep in mind that critical services require at a minimum annual testing. And again, you want to make sure you guys are on the same page. I always recommend requesting recovery times being included, or at least your expectations about recovery, backup responsibilities, cyber resilience. And then, management of third-party outsourced business continuity. How do they manage their third parties? What is their business continuity? And then breach and disruption notification. You want to make sure that they notify you of breaches and disruptions at an appropriate time frame that you've agreed upon. Otherwise, you could end up affected by a breach and not even know about it until reporters and clients are calling you and asking questions. And you will be ill-equipped to provide answers in that scenario. So you want to make sure that you have documented what your expectations are and you guys are in agreement to those. Okay, so now we're going to dig into the what to review. We've touched on when, who, questions to ask, and now we want to really talk about what we're looking at when we do a cybersecurity assessment of a vendor. We want to talk about security testing, sensitive data security, employee, contractor, and vendor management, and then incident detection and response. And we're going to talk about each of these more in depth. So let's just jump right in. Okay, so starting with security testing. This is a great way to identify weakness in a really tangible format. Your vendor's reported security testing should include regular, standardized pen testing or penetration testing of internal and external networks, as well as social engineering testing. You should also consider vulnerability scans and testing, as well as application testing. Social engineering testing should include things like simulated phishing emails and employee awareness tests. These should be performed regularly. Best practice is monthly. Regular security testing should also come with documented follow-up to findings, as well as mitigation of any issues that were found. You want to make sure that your vendor is demonstrating that they are testing for weakness and then following up on any issues and fixing them timely. So it's not enough to know that they're testing. You want to be able to have a little bit of insight into what happens after those tests are performed. And your vendor should really be able to provide you documented evidence that security testing, or specifically penetration testing, application testing, is done at least annually, and preferably by an impartial third party. So the next area is sensitive data security. What this means is, how does your vendor protect data from destructive forces and from the unwanted actions of unauthorized users? Understanding how vendors secure your data at rest and in transit is monumental. They should have controls in place like encryption, data retention and destruction policies, data classification and privacy policies, access management. You want to look for things like secure device baselining. How do they handle remote access? Does that require multi-factor authentication? And this can also include things like, the password policies. How often do they do periodic logical access reviews, network segmentation? There's a lot that rolls into sensitive data security. So really understanding cybersecurity and information security as a whole is going to help you a lot here, especially today when we have a lot of people working remotely. That's kind of our new environment, is a remote environment. And so how does that work? Those are all kind of pieces of that sensitive data security that you want to make sure you have a good handle on. So it's equally important that you look at how your vendor manages their employees, contractors, and then their vendors. When we talk about employee, contractor, and vendor management, you really want to understand your vendor's ability to ensure that their agents are prepared to protect your data. Training of these groups, as well as documented and enforced access management, are critical for data protection. Things like confidentiality agreements, regular security training, management of vendors, and access management are really just kind of some of the ways that a third party can offer you assurance that anyone that is acting as their agent and has access to your data is properly trained. Evidence that a third-party vendor management program or policy is in place is going to be paramount as well. You want to make sure that your vendor is doing as much due diligence as you are. Things like ongoing vendor monitoring, employee background checks, security training, regular security training. Make sure that it's not just one and done. Do they refresh it annually? Those are all parts of that kind of employee, contractor, and vendor management that are really critical when you're talking about evaluating cybersecurity preparedness. So incident detection and response, and even things like cybersecurity insurance coverage are often, somewhat proactive and somewhat reactionary pieces of cybersecurity preparedness. An incident can really be anything that affects the confidentiality, integrity, or availability, or that CIA triad of information or an information system. And incidents happen. It truly is inevitable. They can be small incidents or they can be really big breaches. The key to minimizing the impact is discovering them quickly and then having a plan already in place and well practiced to address them quickly and effectively. So you want to understand, how does your vendor identify an incident? What do they consider an incident? Do they have an effective response plan and a notification procedure? Your vendor should be able to demonstrate to you what they do if an incident occurs, and then how follow-up and resolution is performed, as well as notification steps. Those should be well-documented policies, and they should be detailed. And that's really, just the first step of understanding that incident detection and response. As far as insurance goes, errors and omissions, cybercrime, and sabotage, those are all just some insurance coverages that offer a level of risk transfer and protection against cyber exposure. Cyber insurance is not a substitute for security, but it does offer a level of assurance that a vendor is taking cybersecurity seriously. Okay, so you've done all the things. You've asked all the questions. You've reviewed all the stuff, but your vendor has still been breached. So what's next? The most common repercussions of a vendor data breach really are, increased regulatory scrutiny, possible fines or other monetary impact, loss of customers or customer confidence, and of course, reputational damage. Worst case scenarios that can be hugely business impacting. So you need to be prepared for these things. And let's take a look at that a little bit more in depth. So I think today we can all agree that, we're not talking anymore about if there's a vendor breach. We're talking about when. Ultimately, you want to be proactive, right? So we can respond to a breach. We could talk about that as well. But being proactive is going to be your biggest defense. You want to ensure that you have things like data breach notification requirements in your contract language. Many organizations, throughout time have shared with us that there's distrust between them and their vendors, and a good way to kind of address that proactively is to talk about it up front. You want to make sure you're notified of a breach in a timely manner. You need to ensure that you have set expectations with your vendor, not just about the notification timeline, but what your reaction to that will be. So things like performing deep audit testing. If your vendor is unwilling to cooperate with you when there has been an incident or a breach, then you may need to reconsider that partnership. But talking about that up front is going to be the most helpful way to address it. That type of post-breach activity should just be defined in your contracts when possible. And then you want to be able to define the impact of the breach and be transparent. Make sure that you understand what you're dealing with. Was the breach isolated to one person's PII? Did it impact multiple customers? What's the depth of the breach? Defining that impact is imperative because you're going to want to be transparent with your customers. Acknowledging a breach is a painful exercise. The reputational damage that's caused by a breach can be huge, but you can lessen that by making sure that you are one of the first, if not the first, to be reaching out to your customers and letting them know. You don't want them to find out about it on the news if possible, and having those discussions up front outweighs putting off the inevitable, because ultimately you're going to have to let your customers know. And that's why, when you're talking about all of these things as proactive steps, we talk about it at that contract phase, because at least then you can set the expectations with your vendor, or at least meet in the middle with your vendor. And then when we talk about in-house, you want to be able to determine how it happened. You have to be able to say, hey, how did this even happen? That's where that deep dive audit testing mentioned previously kind of comes in. This is where you're going to get those answers. And you'll have to reevaluate that relationship with the vendor. You want to make sure you're ensuring security measures that you have in your contract are strong and working, but that they actually implemented them. So the other piece of that, though, is also looking internally. Assess your own overall information security processes. Could you have done something different? Do you need to strengthen your protocols? And then, things like implementing more robust user authentication procedures. And then we want to work towards restoring that customer faith, right? Ultimately, a data breach which contains PII of a customer is going to increase that individual's risk of identity theft. So it's a good show of faith to offer credit monitoring services, offer a phone number where they can call for questions, make it as easy for them to deal with as possible. That's just the right thing to do, and it is helpful when you're trying to restore that relationship or keep that relationship. So those are all just little things that you can do internally.
Our next poll question is, has your organization been impacted by a vendor breach? Yes, no, somewhat, or not sure. Lisa, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And this question is, contracts will typically include breach language, but not sure about incident notification. How are incidents defined?
So that's a great question as well, and a tricky one. Incidents can really be a range of things. Anything from a phishing email that an employee clicked on to a server goes down and impacts availability for a short period, all the way to a full-on breach. So really what you need to determine is your threshold for an incident. So if an incident occurs, think about the impacts of those different types of incidents and, what are you looking to be notified about? So I guess, ultimately you just want to be coming to the table with very clear expectations with your vendors so that you guys can either agree or meet in the middle. You can't expect to be notified of every single incident, small incident that occurs, right? That's not realistic. But you have to decide what is important for you. Is downtime important? If a small incident means 2 hours of downtime, is that enough to have impact to you? A full day, loss of information, the loss of PII out to the public. So it just really depends on what your threshold is. I think the takeaway is ultimately that it's not just breaches that you have to think about. It's the smaller things as well, those things that can lead to a breach or the things that can be telltale signs of an impending breach, right? So, if your vendor is constantly having small incidents, is there something going on that they need to up their protections to ensure a breach doesn't happen? So you really just have to be, gain that knowledge and work with your vendor to set those expectations.
And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. It's always interesting to see what everyone says. I'd also like to mention that you'll find our vendor cybersecurity checklist available for download in the related content widget. This is a resource you are definitely going to want to grab, as it shows a checklist of what to ask for from your vendors. Lisa, back to you.
So this slide is just a little recap of the 4 main areas that you want to be investigating when we're talking about checking into your vendor's cybersecurity posture. You want to thoroughly review security testing. This is going to be penetration testing, vulnerability scans, application testing, social engineering. Do they do these things? At what frequency do they do them? Is that adequate? Does it match your expectations? Sensitive data security. This is going to be things like, do they have, encryption in transit and at rest? Are they implementing proper firewalls and IDS equipment? Are they doing the things that they're supposed to be doing that meet best practice standards? Employee, contractor, and vendor management. How are they training their people? Anybody else that acts as an agent for them that has access to your data, are they making sure that they're trained properly? Do they address their third-party contracts the same way that you're addressing yours? You want to make sure those expectations are defined and discussed. And then incident detection and response. Obviously things are going to happen, so then what do? What is their process to make sure that if an incident is found, that they respond to it timely? How do they find incidents? Are those documented? And then, insurance coverage, we talked about this. It is, it does demonstrate that the vendor is taking things seriously. You want to make sure they have some level of coverage, but you cannot accept insurance coverage as a checkbox for cybersecurity protections. It is simply there to pay for an incident, not prevent one. So you just want to make sure that you're not one and doneing cybersecurity insurance coverage. So as we talk about red flags, you'll quickly see that a lot of red flags directly correlate to the things that we've talked about throughout this webinar. So, the first red flag to take into consideration is inadequate testing. Of course, we talk about security testing as something that you really want to focus on. And the reason it's a red flag is because if you don't see testing on your vendors that are medium, high, critical, or technology vendors, then there's potentially an issue with that vendor's cybersecurity controls that they're not even identifying. Best practice, industry standard says that you should have regular security testing, and that means things like penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, social engineering, and not only just the testing, but you also want to see that they're addressing any issues. If they're constantly demonstrating that they have no issues, great, but if they have medium or high findings, what are they doing to counteract that? What's their length of time that it takes them to correct those issues and then retest? So you want to make sure that the testing is performed, that it's followed up with, and that it's adequate. The next kind of red flag to look for is a lack of security policies. It is a red flag if policies are poorly documented, never updated, or non-existent. So things like data retention and destruction policies, data classification and privacy policies, encryption standards, network security policies, access management policies. It is all fine and well to say that you do these things, but if you can't demonstrate that there are policies and procedures in place for staff and leadership to be invested in and be aware of, then they don't exist, right? If it's not written down, it doesn't exist. So you want to make sure that they're taking these things seriously by having adequate policies in place and procedures for the employees. You know, another red flag, and it's hard because, you know, we see incidents more and more and more today. So it's not uncommon for a business to have incident or breaches in the past. But if the vendor that you're looking at has had sensitive data been exposed in the past or multiple times, you know, it's a red flag. So at the very least, you want to review the information regarding the breach or the exposure and fully understand what they put in place to avoid it, right? So what was their response? What's the feedback? What is the customer feedback with them? You know, and then, again, put those notification clauses into your contract. Another thing that we would consider a red flag is a lack of vendor management and security procedures around vendors. So you want to make sure that your vendor takes vendor management as seriously as you do, or more, right? So because their vendors, in a lot of cases, are your fourth parties, and there is a responsibility there from a regulatory standpoint. So making sure that they have a vendor management program in place and that it's sufficient is very important. Insufficient logical access management, user training. We all know, I've said this before, users are often our weakest link. So making sure that there are strong logical access management policies in place, users are trained regularly. There is some type of knowledge-based assessment when it comes to those users being trained. You know, you want to make sure that your agents, your vendor's agents, are protecting your data as if it were their own. And the only way to really demonstrate that is to demonstrate logical access and user training. And then lastly, insufficient security protocols or unremediated vulnerabilities. This goes back to number one. You know, you want to make sure they're demonstrating that they're doing that work. Okay, so as we wrap up this webinar, here are just some key takeaways. And again, you'll see that these align with a lot of the red flags and the 4 areas to review. So number one is include the right to audit language in contracts, right? We talked about breach notification. We talked about the right to audit language. This keeps coming up because it's just really important. A lot of feedback that we get from clients is it's so hard to get information from vendors. And we all know that that's a huge challenge. So one of the best things you can do is proactively set your expectations. And that includes that right to audit language in your contracts. Let them know up front, hey, we're going to want to do these types of reviews on you annually. This is the documentation that we normally will need. Do you agree to this? And if not, find somewhere to meet in the middle. Number 2 seems obvious, but you know, we can't say it enough. You only need to share sensitive data when it's necessary, right? You don't want to just open the gates. So you want to understand what they need truly to do the service that they are providing to you. And then ask for everything you're going to need up front. You know, have those discussions with them. Again, that word proactive, it just keeps coming up, but it really is a big part of this. And then, you know, you want to make sure that you know who to review and when to review them so that you're allocating your resources the best way possible. The worst thing to do is to run out of resources and not have touched the vendors that are the biggest impact. And that, you know, means ensuring that you have the right people doing the review. Who is looking at these vendors to determine criticality, risk? Are they technology-based? What kind of technology do they use? You know, unfortunately, a lot of times you need somebody with information security or cybersecurity background. And I say unfortunately only because a lot of businesses don't have those people at their fingertips. But it really is crucial to making sure you're doing the proper review. And then you want to understand what data you're trying to protect. This kind of circles back to only sharing what you need to, but really you want to know what information do you have? You know, what is going in and out? Because if you're not sure what you have, it's very hard to protect it to the right level. Always include breach notification language in your contracts. Again, that proactive approach. And you want to make sure that you're also prepared with your own breach notification plan, right? You have to look internally, and you want to make sure that you're doing everything that you can so that if there's a breach, you are covered and your customers are covered. And then number 9, say it again, be as proactive as you can, but be ready to be reactive, right? So you want to do as much upfront as you can, but then you want to be able to respond if necessary. These are really just the top key takeaways from today. Thank you so much, and we'll do some Q&A at the end.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Lisa for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On November 2nd, our From the Top Down, the Role the Board and Senior Management Play in Third-Party Risk Management webinar. And on November 7th, our How to Identify Your Credit Union's Critical Vendors webinar. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Lisa, the next question is, does the working remote environment increase a vendor's cyber risk to us?
That's a really great question, and I think the answer today is a little bit different than it was a couple of years ago. Working from home and being remote is now so commonplace, and a lot of people are building their businesses that way. So does it increase your risk? Yes, but I do think that companies are doing a better job of reducing and mitigating that risk. The most important thing you can do as an organization is make sure that your vendors are addressing remote access, that they have policies. You can't treat remote workers the same way that you treat in-house workers. You have to have specific policies and security, in place for that. So it's really about making sure that your vendor is accounting for it and they're doing the right things and that it's being audited. And I think the other piece of remote work that you have to consider too is that you're really depending on your employees to follow the rules and do the right thing. And, we know that sometimes those things don't happen. So what is your vendor doing to have compensating and mitigating controls in place in the off chance that your employee makes a mistake?
Great. Our next question. Do you recommend reviewing my fourth-party cyber program?
So that's a good question, and I think it really comes down to how reliant are you on that fourth party. So if your immediate vendor outsources all of their technology infrastructure, let's say, to a fourth party, and that fourth party is fully responsible for processing, storing, or manipulating your data, you want to have an eagle eye on that fourth party. So you really need to understand the relationship between your vendor and their vendors and make decisions from there. It's not a there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to that. It really just depends on what the relationship is. And so you kind of evaluate those fourth parties in the same way you evaluate the third parties and then factor in the relationship between the two.
Great. Next question. What is best practice when a vendor will not provide their pen testing or DR testing results?
So we get asked this question a lot. It probably comes up every webinar, actually. And the reason it comes up so often is because a lot of times, organizations go to their vendors and say, I need your pen testing results. And most vendors are going to say, absolutely not. And that's okay, because when you ask for results, their mind is going to the very sensitive information that's found in this, particularly pen testing, because it shows the weaknesses of their environment as well as the setup of their environment. So what you want to ask for and what you should expect to receive is executive summary. So you want to get the report that ideally a third party gives that vendor that just outlines, testing was done, the scope of the testing, so what was tested. And then if any findings were found, so any medium or high risk vulnerabilities, and then you want to make sure that the vendor is addressing those. So they should also provide you some type of documentation that says, you know, these are the number of findings that are medium and high risk, this is our plan to remediate them, and this is our timeline, so that you have an actionable item to go back and say, hey, 6 months ago you had a high vulnerability found in your pen testing. Has that been resolved? Have you retested? Can I have the new executive summary? And it feels like a lot of follow-up, but the reality is that getting test results is only half of the battle if there's issues on them. You have to follow through. And so you shouldn't expect to get actual pen testing results or even data center or disaster recovery testing results, but you should expect to be able to get executive summaries or some level of summary of those tests that were performed.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Next question. Our first step in our cyber reviews is to ask for a SOC report. What do you suggest is a good go-to if a vendor doesn't have one?
So it's interesting because I think that SOC reports are becoming more and more common, but I also think that when we're talking about high-risk vendors or critical vendors, a SOC report is often just not enough. You know, so you want to look for policies and procedures. You want to look for, you know, do they have that cybersecurity program? Are they doing that penetration testing? Are they training their employees? So really those 4 things that we were talking about earlier in the presentation, you know, walking through what documentation can you get that will cover those areas. You know, SOC reports are awesome. Obviously, I mean, we encourage you to always get the SOC report. But when you were talking about, you know, large technology vendors or vendors that are handling a lot of sensitive data, you really want to go a step beyond, and that is policies and procedures.
Great. Next question. Since SOC 2 Type 2 reports are pretty comprehensive today, can we use that on its own to review a vendor's cybersecurity posture?
So I think that's just an extension of the last question. And, you know, the other piece of it that you have to factor into it, right, is cost. And we can say, hey, you guys should always do these extensive reviews and vet every vendor. And the reality is that you're constrained by your organization, your number of people, your resources, and money. And so if you can't do more than a SOC report, the SOC 2 Type 2 does have a lot of information. And so if you just know what to look for, you can get a lot out of it. So, you know, I think those 2 questions kind of go hand in hand. It really depends on risk, criticality, resources.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Lisa, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank and online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, including vendor cybersecurity. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of Inminder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.